Welcome back to the AAPG Sustainable Development Podcast. My name is Sarah Barnes, and I'm an earth scientist at Chevron, and we'll be hosting this podcast today with Julian Chenin. The purpose of the AAPG Sustainable Development Committee is to communicate broadly the positive technical, economic, environmental, and social benefits of the petroleum industry and its collective efforts towards sustainable development, which this podcast is one of the ways we strive to accomplish this. A quick disclaimer before we begin. The opinions shared in the podcast are views from the featured company and are not necessarily representative of the larger group of companies involved in AAPG. Hey, Julian.
Hey, Sarah. Welcome back. It's great to be back. And hello, everyone. My name is Julian Chenin. I recently graduated with my master's from the University of Oklahoma, and I'm currently working as a geophysical data scientist at Blueware. Today, however, we are very excited to be hosting Lucy King from Wood Mac. So welcome, Lucy. Thank you so much for coming on to the show today and talking more. Speaking of which, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your career as well as the role at Wood Mac?
Yeah, of course. Hi guys, nice to be here. So I'm actually a geologist by background. I studied petroleum geology at Aberdeen University, so that's in the northeast of Scotland. And this was back in the early 2010s when the upstream industry was booming, the oil price was over $100 per barrel. And I remember everyone just kept saying to me, oh, exploration geologists are in such high demand, you're not going to struggle to find a job. So I kind of went through uni thinking, oh, I'll just stroll into an E&P company. But then the year I graduated was actually the year the oil price crashed back in 2015. And all of the graduate geologist positions almost dried up overnight. So at that point, I decided to go study a master's in exploration geology at the University of Manchester, hoping that the industry might have recovered over the course of that year. But unfortunately, that was not the case. But when I graduated, I was still determined to find a job where I could at least use some of the skills and knowledge I'd learned throughout both of my degrees. So I was determined to be a geologist in some form or another.
Mm-hmm.
And luckily, I've managed to find a job as a geoscientist at a small startup in Edinburgh, where I focused on geophysical scanning of the subsurface for natural materials. And this was a really great introduction into kind of a work environment. I got to do field work, engage with clients, produce reports. So yeah, just a really good kind of foundation role. And I was there for a year before I then started at Wood Mac, where my first role was within the North Sea upstream team. And within this team, I was responsible for the analysis of everything that happened within the North Sea, kind of anything to do with oil and gas. So that primarily involved creating and updating field models, such as updating the production profile, adding in any spend on new wells, updating operating costs, and so on. But then I'd also get the chance to speak to clients on a regular basis, be that virtually or in person on research trips, which was really cool. However, being based in the UK team, they'd be either Aberdeen or London, so not really too exotic relative to other teams. But I did this role for about 3.5 years before the internal role within the CCUS team came up. And I think it was the perfect time for me as I was kind of reaching the point where, although I really enjoyed the role that I was currently doing, I think I was just ready for a bit of change. And that kind of brings me up to where I am now. So I've been in the CCUS team for just over a year, and it's definitely been a steep learning curve as I'm sure everyone's aware. It's like everything about the industry is pretty new. But I think it's so exciting to be a part of such an emerging industry and just seeing how much potential it has to kind of shape the future. The team I'm in, though, it's primarily focused on the above ground markets, so tracking all of the global projects, who's involved, the industries targeted, and so on. And I'm then responsible for taking this data set and conducting analysis on it for reports or presentations to key stakeholders, be that internal colleagues or clients. But then we also have a sister team at the company who focus on the subsurface side of the industry. But there is a lot of overlap in the work that we do, and we work really closely with them.
That's really cool, Lucy. You mentioned the oil crash of 2015, but then there's also the COVID pandemic and other things that have continued to shape the industry and have highs and lows. So it's really neat seeing how you've taken, a true geology education and kind of shifted it into this space working at Wood Mac. And I mean, all this new energy stuff, especially CCUS, is so cool and so new. It's very exciting to be a part of. Can you give us an idea of some of the analysis that you do in that space?
Yeah, of course. So a lot of the work I do focuses on analyzing global trends and themes within the CCUS industry. So that can be in the form of regular market updates, where I'll cover kind of what's changed or what's new in the industry for that quarter, or producing topical insights on particular events, such as a project starting operations or a country announcing new CCUS support. But one of the most recent pieces of work that we published towards the end of last year was actually analysing the biggest trends and themes we think we're going to see within the industry over the next year.
Okay, so that's really interesting then, because as you kind of do these different analyses, you also kind of have that geological background as well. It's just like,
Mhm.
okay, well, what are the technical aspects of it to consider as well? That's really interesting. So building on that, where or what do you think will be the biggest trends and themes for CCUS in 2023?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, like CCUS is obviously still a very like nascent industry, but the growth it's seen in just the past few years has been incredible. We saw a lot of progress in 2022 from all aspects of the industry. And I think if I had to characterize last year, I'd say it was definitely a year for like laying the groundwork. And to be honest, I think that's really where it's going to continue into this year. I think we're going to really see, yeah, a lot more groundwork being laid before we see projects move from that announcement stage to reality. Last year, we tracked over 200 new projects. So that was across capture, transport, and storage scopes. And that's great. But what we didn't really see much of was existing projects progressing through key milestones to progress the development past that early stage of development. So, kind of leading on from that, the first key theme we've predicted for this year is that we expect this progression to start to pick up, especially at major storage hubs in the US and Europe. So when I talk about a storage hub, I'm referring to like a storage site. So that could be a depleted oil and gas reservoir or a saline aquifer located on or offshore, depending on the location. And that will be operated to receive captured CO2 from third-party emitters. And I think getting the first of these storage hubs across the line is quite a time critical thing, because progression for a lot of capture projects is contingent on these storage hubs going ahead. Without these hubs, there's nowhere really for this captured CO2 to go. So if we see any delay for these projects, it's going to have a huge knock-on effect.
Yeah, so if capture projects need to wait for these storage sites, do you think companies will prioritize developing their storage portfolios first in the near term?
Yeah, exactly that. And that kind of brings me on to the second main theme included in the piece. So, one of the things that took us by surprise in 2022 was the level of interest in storage licensing. So, last year we saw lots of licensing activity in countries such as Australia, where we saw 5 licenses awarded. We also saw activity in Norway. And then in the UK, we saw the world's largest CCS round open for bids with 13 areas on offer. And these are due to be awarded any day now, which is quite exciting, and definitely keeping my eyes peeled for that announcement. But just for a bit of background for anyone unfamiliar with how licensing works for CO2 storage, from what we've seen so far, it's being run in a very similar way to how oil and gas licensing rounds are conducted, but obviously with the kind of slight regional differences. So, for example, once a company is awarded a license, they then have a certain time period to basically explore and appraise a suitable storage site within the area. So, that could be a depleted oil and gas reservoir or a saline aquifer. And then on top of that, there could also be certain work commitments to fulfill, such as drilling an appraisal well by a certain date. But for 2023, whilst we think the rate of storage licensing will continue, if not even accelerate, we think that given how many new licenses were awarded last year, companies will now start to focus on the appraisal and workup of these areas, which is going to require investment from these companies. And we'll see this for both depleted reservoirs and saline aquifers. But depleted reservoirs, they have the upper hand though in terms of their understanding, as they've already gone through extensive appraisal programs prior to oil and gas extraction. However, their capabilities for CO2 injection and storage will still need investigation. But overall, from a kind of data perspective, our understanding of depleted reservoirs is far superior to that of saline aquifers. As with saline aquifers, you're effectively starting from scratch. A lot of them haven't even had a single well drilled into them. So there is currently a massive data gap in terms of our understanding of these sites. But hopefully this year we'll see some headway with this as companies start to make that leap into the unknown.
Right. And I mean, it's really exciting to see all of that activity that's happening, not just on sort of a localized scale, but truly on a global scale. And you're also seeing that kind of overlap, not just from the technical side, right? The geoscientists understanding reservoir, but also in the processes too, like how the bid rounds work and et cetera. So that's really interesting to also see that overlap as well. And across the two themes that you've spoken about so far, it sounds like there is going to be a lot of investment required by companies, especially with all those bid rounds over the next few years. Is the right level of support in place to assist companies with this, or are there other things to also further consider?
Yeah, so this is actually one of the hottest topics in the industry and something our clients ask us about all the time. As like the support for CCUS, it's really the primary controlling factor in the deployment of CCUS technology. Just given the high cost of capture, transport, and storage currently, the majority of projects can't go ahead without support, be that in the form of government funding, fiscal incentives, carbon pricing, or another mechanism of that kind. For the projects that are either in construction or operational today, government policy has played a major role in their economics, with in some cases over 50% of the required capex being funded. But for most countries today, we're seeing the rate of growth and demand for CCUS outpace the respective government's ability to legislate for it. And I think it can actually get quite frustrating for companies who are being held up by this. Like they're wanting to progress their projects, but they can't do that without the right kind of framework in place.
Hmm.
Like some countries do have the regulation and support in place, such as the US, like they've got the 45Q tax incentive. And in the UK, it's got a £1 billion CCS infrastructure fund, which is basically this big funding pot that the government are going to use to kind of provide support to these infrastructure hubs and emitters. And that's why we're seeing the industry really pick up pace within these locations. The US, UK, and other European countries, they're really at the forefront of the industry currently. As companies, they can progress projects here with much less risk than in countries with no support in place. But in saying that, like no country has it figured out yet. Every country is approaching its regulation and support for CCUS differently. Like nowhere has nailed the right combination of incentives and support yet. And
Hmm.
even the existing frameworks are being reworked. Like last year, we saw the 45Q enhanced through the Inflation Reduction Act. And I mentioned at the start that 2023 would continue to be kind of a laying the groundwork year. And I think that's especially true for countries looking to get the right support in place.
Hmm.
This year, we're expecting Asia to see a lot of momentum in this space. The project pipeline in Asia is expanding, but for most projects, their progress is being hindered by the lack of support and regulation in place. However, we expect countries such as Malaysia and Indonesia to finalize regulations and incentives for CCUS. And then we also expect countries such as Thailand and China to make massive strides in their funding framework for CCUS projects.
This is really cool, Lucy. It's cool to see the like global perspective of the challenges that are there for CCUS. So if I'm a geoscientist, how do I get more involved in CCUS?
Yeah, so like I mentioned earlier, CCUS is still in such an early stage of development. So there aren't really any experts who have been involved since the very start of their careers, or there aren't really any established career paths as such. Most people in the industry I've engaged with, they've kind of redesigned their careers to come into CCUS, be that from an oil and gas background, engineering, or really anything, to be honest. I think as long as you've got a passion for something, you can really mold your background to fit into that. But if it's one thing I've learned since working within the industry is that your background or degree, it can prepare you for the role that you want, but it doesn't necessarily have to define the role that you get. For example, yeah, if you're a geoscientist wanting to get into the CCUS industry, you may be thinking that it's just the below ground side of the industry that is relevant to you. So that's like the subsurface evaluation, exploring for storage sites. And that's totally fair if that's your goal. But the point I want to make is that you don't have to think that as a geoscientist, you're limited to just that side of the industry. Like the role I'm in now is not the role I thought I would end up in, as I'm not your typical geologist analyzing the subsurface. However, I wouldn't be in this role without my geologist background. Like I may not use a lot of the technical skills I learned in my degrees, but my degrees have given me a lot of context for just what goes on in the industry. But just to summarize before I ramble on for too long, I think the best advice I can give to anyone wanting to get into CCUS, be that from university or from a current position within industry, is just to be really open about all the opportunities that are out there. Like explore the roles that might not sound like your ideal job, as you never know where they'll end up taking you. I think there's a lot of pressure to think that you've got to find your perfect job straight away. And I think that for most, that's never really the case. But I think we're at a really exciting point in the CCUS industry. There's going to be so much expansion over the next few years. And with that will come a ton of job opportunities. So yeah, so just throw yourself out there, be open, and see what happens.
Just throw yourself out there and explore. Yeah, I mean that really is amazing advice, Lucy. And you're completely right, because as we continue moving forward into CCS, right, and advancing these projects, context is everything. You need to understand it within the subsurface. So, absolutely, with geoscience, right, it provides the perfect kind of backbone and foundation for the CCS foundation. So, yeah. But really, thank you so much, Lucy, for coming onto the podcast today, sharing so much fantastic advice, your thoughts, your outlooks. We really appreciate it, and it's been fantastic learning more. Sarah, did you have any final comments or closing thoughts that you'd like to share?
No, it's just really great hearing from someone who's, earlier in their career expanding into this new space, and really great overview of kind of the state of CCUS today and the things that people are looking at and focused on. So thank you so much, Lucy. It's been great talking to you and getting to know you.
Yeah, been great chatting to you guys.